welcome to everybody. Hope you're all staying safe and well, and wherever you are, the weather is getting better, and hopefully we'll all be able to actually meet together again and see what we all look like with our haircuts. Okay, let's get started, mate, shall we?
So I'll start. Firstly, thanks for having us back. It's been a while since we've done bits and pieces with you guys. So I'm James Watts. I'm the head of marketing at Databarracks. I was trying to think how far back it was that we originally started working with CSF, and I think it's the best part of 10 years, which is incredible. But so you might perhaps know me perhaps from some of those events where we picked up the bar tab at the pub after a meeting. Julie, so I'll let you, Julie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Julie Goddard. I'm a business continuity consultant for Databarracks. I've been in business continuity for around 16 years, but prior to that I worked in IT, service delivery and service management. Worked in many different industries and been involved in many real-life incidents of all types of disruption, pretty much everything you can think of, including cyber attacks, where I've been in a response team. Yeah, that's me pretty much.
Cool, let me jump in then. So I've got a first very quick slide just to kind of give you some background on us, to hopefully update you on what's probably changed since we last spoke to you guys, and then give you a sense of where we're all coming from. So if you do know of Databarracks, the name comes from some ex-military nuclear bunker data centers that we use to do backup and disaster recovery. So that was kind of what we would have been all about when we would have last spoken to you. And then a couple of things that have changed in the interim. Firstly, we've always had a public cloud practice, but mostly focused on things like highly scalable web apps. So things like we do the flood alerting system for the Environment Agency, which obviously doesn't do very much for an awful lot of time, and then there's an issue and it kind of goes crazy. And then some similar bits. So in charities, things with campaigns or scalable needs for Wellcome Trust or Save the Children. But the thing that's changed for us in the last couple of years is we've made a shift to push all backup and disaster recovery now into the public cloud. So kind of big majorities in Azure, and then AWS, and then kind of Google after that. And then the last service we've got on the right of the screen is kind of where Julie comes in, which is a lot of people tend to use terms backup and DR and BC pretty interchangeably. So, they're all sort of the same thing. For us, they're kind of very distinct, different things. And business continuity is the kind of overarching, I guess, coverall for all of these things. And it's, for us, it's all the stuff that isn't the tech. So for all the customers where we would set up the disaster recovery, and we document how you do your recovery of all your systems, and we'd hand back these runbooks and say, right, plug that into your business continuity plan. And in a lot of cases, a lot of people didn't have an overall business continuity plan. The size of company that we generally have as customers is not the really, really small, one or two people, and it's not the massive Tesco tens of thousands of people. It's kind of medium-sized organizations that have a need for that, but probably don't have someone who works on continuity full-time. So it tends to fall to someone. So I guess we launched this service relatively recently, and it's why we're now working with Julie and others who do that kind of wider overarching part of business continuity. And the bits that if I jump to agenda, we're going to talk about today we wanted to kind of have a quick kind of run through of all the things that have changed in the last sort of 12 months with the pandemic. Because business continuity and resilience, it's kind of shifted. And I guess it's a bit similar to remote working in that a lot of these trends didn't start last year. They were already some way along the way. But everything got accelerated and shifted. And I think now it's we're in a very different place. So we're going to look at kind of biggest risks, convergence of BC and cyber in particular, who's in the crisis management team, dealing with multiple issues all at once, and then something like a pandemic, so the big kind of societal risks. So the first one I'll start with a kind of, the first is a positive note, and that's in business continuity. We often talk about PPRS, so People, premises, resources, and suppliers is the kind of major elements that you need to look after. And actually, this year, everyone's shifted to working remotely, and it's no longer the case that really the office is that kind of central major risk. But that change also then means everything else has moved around. So I'll pass over to Julie to kind of talk about all the rest of it.
Yeah, no, thanks, James. Hello, everyone, by the way, and happy Friday, I should say, because we're all pleased it's Friday, aren't we? Yeah, I mean, as James was saying, you know, as he's got on the slide there, you know, at one time it was all about people in one place, in one building, centralised risk. And when I worked at my last role at the Solicitors Regulation Authority, believe me that the building was far more trouble than ever the IT was, or any other kind of issue that we used to have. But obviously, and it's going to state really obvious now, but we've all become so much more reliant on IT. But obviously, the rapid rollout of remote working has introduced a lot more risks, because the speed at which it was done has meant that a lot of IT teams have had to play catch up. There was issues getting laptops in some cases, laptop supply, but you guys will obviously be familiar with, and maybe even a little bit nervous about, the fact that people would have rolled out IT without considering the security risks and the you know, the endpoint user exposure, because the bad guys know that you've got people working remotely now who may be naive, who may click on links, who may do things which introduce bugs and stuff into and cyber attacks in. So, you know, it's all about this whole perimeter security and how we protect that. And I think that's really come to the fore. And as you're probably aware, ransomware attacks have absolutely gone through the roof. And it's a real concern. I mean, personally, as a BC professional, if I was lying awake worrying about something at night as a head of a company, I think it would be a ransomware attack. Because I just think that is the thing that is so prevalent at the moment. And it was interesting, I was looking at an article in Computer Weekly the other week, saying that they are talking about, there's talk about whether insurance should be banned from paying out for ransom attacks. And I think there's possibly a case for that. Personally, I know it's a balance, but we don't want to be feeding the beast. So when we have the discussion at the end, I'll be interested to know what people think about that. But I think we've got to be careful that the rhetoric doesn't get too skewed to talk about paying the ransom. It's really all about how do we stop it happening in the first place. And for me, I think really one of the biggest risks is looking at the whole cyber, looking at the whole security around your IT now to see where the exposures are. And if you've got gaps, then you should be filling them. You definitely should be plugging those gaps. So that's the biggie for me. The other thing is sparsely populated buildings. So you've got often buildings that are left now sitting empty or with very few people in. And in the last year or so, there's been at least 3, probably more, big failures caused by environmental issues in computer rooms. Most memorably that you may be aware of that kind of hit the computer press was obviously UK South overheating. They had a cooling issue last September, which took out UK South. I think if you got geo redundancy, obviously you'd be fine. But I mean, that's one example. But, you know, UPS is failing. All sorts of issues around the environment that you have to ask, well, is that happening because there's no one on site managing these situations and keeping an eye on them in the way that they may be used to, or maybe they can't react quickly enough because they're not on site, or maybe they haven't got the right alerting mechanisms in place. So that's another area of consideration. But the other thing, kind of going, you know, into completely different sphere of risk, I suppose, is obviously the staff health. And there's been a big focus on mental health, obviously, because people are working from home and you're not getting the team connectivity, you're not getting the bonding, the social aspect of going to work. And I mean, it's obviously been well documented, well recorded that it's an issue. But just to tell you a story about somebody actually that you know, used to work in IT that came into my job in the SRA. You know, he was so used to dealing with machines, basically, you know, machines which are logical, you reboot them, they come back up, or you can fix them. but one of the challenges I had with John coming into my role was explaining to him that in business continuity, you're not only dealing with machines and people, machines and logic, you're actually dealing with people and emotions. And just as if to make the point right on cue, last November, we were working together, John and I, doing a handover, and lo and behold, the London Bridge attack kicked off, not very far from our London office. I mean, literally within eyesight. So I got a message from NAXO, who I'm hooked into, the counter-terrorism unit, got onto a call to them, and they were clearly quite distressed, although no one was actually affected physically, but they could see what was happening from the window. And we talked it through and we got them in the right place, made sure they were locked in so they couldn't go out and walk towards any issue. And then when we came off the phone, he said, oh, well, no one was injured, were they? And, you know, they'll be fine. And, you know, they should just man up and not worry about it too much. And I said, actually, John, you have to be very careful because, you know, you're not dealing with the machines anymore. This is people with real emotions. So it was an interesting thing that John, coming from an IT background, has had to go through a whole learning curve about that side of business continuity, which has nothing to do with tech. So that was interesting. So again, I think that is one of the big risks now that we're facing, is how we keep our teams mentally fit so that they're able to do the jobs they're able to do from home, but without losing, you know, without losing that team bonding and the feeling of being a part of a bigger thing. So that's really, I think, where we should be looking. But certainly for my money, I think cyber and ransomware is the thing that's most prevalent at the moment. It would be my top of my list of concerns, I have to say.
I'll move on to the next slide. This one, Julie, but yeah, just to reiterate on that, I think probably if there's one thing that we can share from kind of our perspective as Databarracks, there's a lot of things that we don't see in terms of kind of cyber threats for our customers. You know, anything that's getting prevented at the prevention stage, you know, we have no visibility over that. But the thing that we get called in for is obviously when something goes wrong and we need to recover the data. And at the moment, it's the ransomware attacks are so common. I mean, we say it's in the press a lot, but the attacks are so much more kind of prevalent than that. It's very rare for us that we don't have at least one major recovery going on every week. And it does hit everyone. I mean, it hits the people that we see. So things like, you know, the NHS with WannaCry, a lot of people in manufacturing does seem to be being targeted. But beyond that, it's a real kind of widespread of everyone else getting hit, sort of indiscriminate of size or industry. So it's, you know, it is the one that you know needs, you know, you need to watch out for. Sorry. So the next point then is kind of on this then, Julie. It's this kind of convergence.
Yeah, sure. So in the world of business continuity, in the business continuity profession, there's a lot of talk about business continuity, disaster recovery, and cyber working closer together, and that's become about because of the whole COVID situation. Now, personally, I came from an IT background, so I'm used to working with the IT guys and with the cyber guys. So for me, it's not an issue. But in many organisations where there are separate BCDR and cyber functions, they often don't gel together properly, or they hadn't gelled properly together. And in particular, I've seen lots of situations where the business continuity team aren't involved quickly enough in an incident when it started off in a technical environment, be it a disaster recovery or cyber. But I think, you know, now that we've been through COVID, one of the big learnings for some organisations is that collaborative working that's needed. And, you know, going forward, there is a strong argument that they should be brought under one high-level function that will label resilience. And that obviously within that should include facilities. It could include HR for the people side of things. We've already talked about mental health. You know, health and safety. So, and there's even talk, and I've actually seen roles advertised for a chief resilience officer. Not many organisations have that yet, but some do. It's starting to appear, and it's also starting to appear at board, you know, it's actually sitting at board level. So it's got a real voice at the top table. And when we have the discussion at the end, I'd be interested to see and understand from you guys how in your organisations business continuity, disaster recovery and cyber work together. So even if you don't have a dedicated business continuity manager, hopefully you have somebody that is responsible for BC. So it'd be interesting to understand how those functions work together and how they've worked together in the past 12 months. Because personally, I couldn't do my job without being part of that fusion of teams, if you like. To me, if you aren't working with other departments closely enough, then you're not doing your job properly. Is my personal view. But yeah, COVID's been a real catalyst for this, and long may it continue is all I can say. Because the sooner you can bring in your business continuity people at the start of an incident, even if it's an early warning and you're not sure how it's going to play out, the quicker the business are going to be ready for when an incident occurs, which I think kind of goes on to the next slide, I think, James.
Yes. Yeah, so we want to share this as a quote. So we host a business continuity podcast, like everyone does a podcast nowadays, but it's called the Bcp Cast, where we go out and talk to all the people that do BC at the really big organisations. So we've spoken to folks from Google and BP and the Guardian, people are really kind of really good at this. And we spoke to this chap who is works at the insurance company Marsh now, but he also heads up the international standard for resilience. And so one of the questions that we asked him was, why do you even need a standard for resilience? What's the, we've already got things for security, we've got stuff for BC, and his take on this is that all of these individual risk management disciplines don't get the job done individually. It's having BC doesn't make you resilient. You need all of these things. There's this transition now to not just recovering from an incident, but how do you make sure you're always kind of always on and always ready and always prepared.
So that kind of links with this next thing, is about who is in your BC and your crisis team now. So it kind of links to what I was just saying, really, is that it should be a fusion of people. And again, when we have the discussion at the end, throughout the COVID situation, for instance, I'd be interested if you guys have been drawn into meetings, with and who's around your typical crisis team, around the table when you have an incident or when you need to discuss steps or whatever in the COVID situation, because it needs to definitely, include all the key people we've talked about, plus, as I say, facilities, HR, health and safety, as well as the BCDR and cyber teams. Appreciate, again, as I say, not everyone will have a BC function, but you should have someone who's responsible for business continuity within their role, even if you don't have a dedicated team. So if we can move on to the next slide, James.
Yeah.
That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Next slide.
Yeah. So yeah, this is and it's another quote from someone we spoke to when we did the podcast, which wasn't related to COVID, but I think obviously relates to kind of where we are now. And this, Catherine's a lady who works as a BC manager for a big corporate law firm, and she was talking here about, if you remember the Kingsway fire, which was a few years ago in Holborn. It was a big electrical fire that ran under the street, and it ran for about 4 days. It took power out to the entire kind of Holborn area and some of the West End. And the issue that a lot of folks had with it is that not only was your power down, but people had generators to revert to in case, but they weren't allowed to use their generators because there was an electrical risk with it. And it was something that sort of hit them in a lot of their other planning of how do you deal with when not just one thing goes wrong, but also something else goes wrong, which I think ties in exactly to kind of where we are now, kind of living through a really, really extended crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's absolutely vital as well that, leaders within organisations don't get distracted, because you guys know in security that distraction is a key weapon, isn't it, when it comes to launching attacks. So, typically an organisation will be focused on something like COVID or other situations, and whilst people are distracted, they could be being attacked from another direction. or have other incidents going on that they're not noticing because they've got their head down and they're not looking what's coming at them left field or horizon scanning to see where the next risk might be coming from. And that really happens a lot because people just get very focused on one thing. And one of the exercises I do with organisations when I'm implementing BC involves exactly that, a distraction crime. So whereby you get a team or an organisation hooked onto one particular problem that you've created. Meanwhile, somebody's hacked into your systems, planting time bombs all over the place, but you've got so distracted with something more mundane, such as a server failure, that you don't notice that actually you're being hacked until it's too late. And that's not untypical of what happens. But it's absolutely vital that the right people are in place to deal with multiple concurrent crises. And I'd be interested to know if any of you have had that experience in the last 12 months where you've been caught up on one problem and then something else has happened at the same time. And not only that, but in the current COVID situation, you may not have the right people available to deal with it because, of the way we're working now, people are actually working from home. Do you need to get someone on site to deal with it, and how quickly can you get them there, and so on and so forth. So, multiple concurrent crises do happen, and people shouldn't ever get too focused on one thing without lifting the head up and seeing what else is coming at them left field. It's really vital that you do that, because if you've got one problem, then it's obviously just going to get more and more compounded the more stuff that goes wrong. So absolutely vital. On to the next slide, please, James.
Yep.
So this last slide here, it's from the World Economic Forum. Their report came out last year. And it's just interesting to see the top risks by likelihood and impact. And in actual fact, I suppose what struck me most about this, on the impact side, on the right-hand side, infectious diseases magically shot to the top, where it was like number 20 last year before COVID kicked off, amazingly. But on impact, there's nothing about cyber at all. And yet on the left-hand side, by likelihood, it does actually appear second, well, sort of second from the bottom there, number 9. But I actually think the likelihood is higher than that impact, personally. Again, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
So we do a lot of, in the last 12 months, we ended up doing a lot of backup for Office 365 data in particular, because I think everyone shifted, a lot of people using Office 365. And then I think in the past, even though people have been using it, you've been using it to an extent, and it hasn't been as business critical. So there hasn't really been the thought about, needing to back it up, or kind of the issues if something's removed out of the recycle. But the issue with SaaS products is that you can have a backup for it, but you can't really have an effective DR strategy for it. If Office 365 goes down, you can't really power up your own Office 365, or you can try and run something back on an on-premise Exchange server. It's just not really a practical consideration usually. So you for those SaaS products, you quite often you're waiting for it to come back. Which so go for it, Julie.
Sorry, I was just going to say, one of the things that strikes me, and I suppose I noticed this coming from an IT background, is quite often people buy cloud services without necessarily understanding what they've bought in terms of resilience. That it's not necessarily been built into the contract, and it doesn't have resilience in depth, if you like, all the way through, and that often people don't find out until things go wrong. And it's a real learning for people to make sure they absolutely understand what they've bought from the cloud service provider in terms of resilience, and also what you're responsible for and what they're responsible for, because it's not always clear, and people make assumptions about what they've got and then they find out when it goes wrong they haven't got what they thought they got.
There was a question that sort of cropped up earlier, if I may sort of just act as proxy on this and just ask the question, and it was really around that whole Azure thing. And as you say, people saying, well, I've bought that, everything's in the cloud, so I've got nothing to worry about. It was like, sorry, okay, forget the business continuity. That's done. Tick on the list. I'm talking to somebody, or talk to the person about that, and the conversation was, yeah, but what are you going to do when bits of that go wrong? And you treat it all as one thing, or because bits of it can go down. How do you deal with that?
That's kind of where we've come, because for a long time, most of what we were doing were on-premise IT infrastructure and replicating it into a cloud. Now, as people have shifted, and we have people in Azure, and as you say, you're now looking at it as to what do you do there, and there's different options. I mean, there's when you build an application in the cloud natively, there are lots of ways that you can kind of build the resiliency and make sure that you don't do kind of backup and DR in the way that we used to. You build things to we talk about it. It's the cattle versus pets analogy, if people know this one. So in your own data center, you treat your servers as pets. If they get sick, you nurse them back to health, you keep them going. In a cloud, you treat everything as cattle. If it gets sick, you put it down, you move on. You've got you look after the herd, and you kind of keep spinning up other ones. And I think it's kind of a bit of a mix with Azure, because a lot of people, I think, have moved things kind of in a sort of vaguely lift and shift manner. Then you want to look at you need to kind of push it to a different region, and there's kind of, you can do that with ASR, you can do it with with some of the other products, and then I think that the kind of stage beyond that is, if you're not comfortable with something being in the same cloud, how do can you do multi-cloud resilience, which is there are a few products that do it, and we do it in a small number of cases at the moment. But then you kind of get into the world of high egress charges, because some of those cloud providers don't really want you to be pushing it around into other places. They make it very easy to move in, and perhaps not quite as easy to replicate to somewhere else. It's becoming quite a regular message that we're sending out, is to review your recovery retention policies. Because, and certainly on our side for backup became not very interesting. Not that it's ever wildly interesting, but it became really, really uninteresting for a few years when disaster recovery and replication technology suddenly became affordable. And no one really cared about their backups anymore. They all wanted to replicate, because you can bring your systems back really, really quickly. But replication technologies generally don't give you a very, very long window to recover from. And then I think because people had sort of shifted their objectives, they didn't have a long window. So it's a thing that we're pushing. We've had a couple of instances recently where there's been ransomware that has been sitting on systems for a long time deliberately to outweigh retention policies. So and if you think about like an old tape rotation policy, where you'd be keeping your weeks, and then you keep your weekend for a period, and then your month end, the further that goes back, the problem you then have is, if you're recovering from, it's either last week or the week before, you're losing a week's worth of data on that recovery, versus if you've got a daily copy every one of them. In some cases, because the deduplication technology works really well now, you can keep more copies, and it's not so expensive to do so. But everything's always a balance of how many versions you want to keep versus what the risk of it is. Yeah,
it's interesting that offline tape backups are making a comeback back to the 1990s, because obviously once it's on a tape in a cupboard, nobody can get to it, and it sounds bizarre, doesn't it, in 2021? But I've seen that tape's making a comeback. And the other thing that was that I saw the other day that kind of made me smile, although it's not funny really, is that the whole ransomware thing is such an industry now that you can actually buy ransomware attacks as a service, which is like, yeah, like, wow. But that's the place we're in, unfortunately. It's quite scary, really, when you think about what they could get into. And the obvious other thing is, whilst they are encrypting your data, who knows what other holes they've punched in your security. And for me, that comes back to the distraction thing. So you might think that you've been, attacked by ransomware, and maybe it's not as bad as it could be. But who knows whether they've actually done anything else that you're not yet aware of, or you may not find out until sometime down the line. And actually, maybe the ransomware was just the distraction that was less serious than the much bigger thing they've done. So do you think then that insurers should stop paying ransom payouts? I think they should stop covering that.
I think it's an interesting question, and it's one that has cropped up, and I think there's an ethical dimension to this, and certainly for charities. So when I'm talking to colleagues in charities and clients, it's, for me, I often say to people, this is the question you need to engage your board with. So if you have a board that thinks information security is just an IT issue, if you have a board that doesn't believe there's a cybersecurity risk, then just pose this question to them. Okay, this is ransomware, this is what it does. Your way to get out of this is to recover, if you've got something to recover from, or pay up. And that's a board level question. It's not an IT department question. It's not an information security officer question. It's a board question.
Yeah. And if you want to run it, all I would say is I recommend you absolutely run a cyber attack BC exercise with the business and with the cyber team and with the IT people. And if you want any help with designing that, come and shout, because I've done one and it was really interesting and involved, but it produced some great results at the end.
That's a great idea, Julian. Perhaps that's something we could plan out for a future session.
Yeah.
So I think we've just about come to a natural end. Do you want to wrap it up, Brian?
I'd like to thank James and Julie for their input. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us in the first place and asking their questions. I've enjoyed it, and it's nice talking through BCP and so on again, like the old days. Thanks to everybody, and we will see you at the next one, the next First Friday Forum.